Religion, science, myths, and legends all point toward the next evolution in human consciousness. What do the invisible realms hold? Who's telling us and how do they know? We're investigating insights from around the world to answer the question, what does the material world arise out of and where do we go once we've dropped the body? You're about to go interdimension with Robert Wallace and Adam Jeffries to undiscovered spiritual realities.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. It's that special time, folks, when we delve into those things that ought not be discussed too broadly. So hang in there if it goes sideways for you, because I've got a great show in store for you. This hour, we're going to be discussing the nature of materialism and why and how we lost our spiritual vision in lieu of it. We're going to be talking about the epochs of Earth's evolution according to theosophical and anthroposophical insight, and where we are in the chain of events unfolding and yet to come. And also in a little bit, if we have time, we're going to talk about the spiritual components of man. So today is the festival of the Epiphany, taught by some as the day the three wise men came to Jesus, and others as the actual day that Christ came down into Jesus. So look it up if you haven't heard of it. How you doing, Adam?
Man, I'm great. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on board. I'm honored.
Thanks for being part of the process. I want to give our listeners, because this is our first show, a background of who we are.
Cool.
And then where our thought process is, where we're coming from. And I think I'm going to let you open it.
Okay.
Let's talk a bit about yourself.
Okay, cool. So my background, spiritually, is that I was brought up in a family of musicians who didn't necessarily subscribe to any one religion. My mom was brought up in a Catholic home, and my dad was brought up in a Methodist. And by the time that I was a child, they had just kind of not chosen either one, really. So, of course, I heard about Jesus and knew about that. And in my cultural surrounding, I grew up in Western Kentucky. So there were a lot of churches, and so I was hearing a lot about the Jesus story. But my parents were super open and said, you choose your path. You know, whatever feels right to you, whatever you feel like you believe, you choose that. And I'm grateful for that. It is just amazing to grow up in a family that was so open, because I hear so many horror stories of families where they were like, you have to believe this and this is the only way. And so I really got to choose my own path, which is a beautiful thing. And for me, I felt like there was something more than the world that I saw around me from a very young age. But of course, didn't know what that was. And I had a very vivid imagination, and I loved the imagination realm and playing, and I would play for hours by myself rather than with other kids. I enjoyed using my imagination and creating other characters and things. So I was always open to that idea. Then I dove more into what is this church thing as I got a little older. I had a lot of friends that were like, man, you need to come hang out in our youth group, and we need you in our choir at the church. That was the big one. We need to get Adam in church. He doesn't go to church. So, and being in a family of musicians, they knew that I sing and play instruments. So they're like, come play in the church band or sing in the church choir. And I did that, and I ended up in youth group. And long story short, I ended up believing the Jesus story pretty intensely, and mostly not just because my friends did and the peer pressure thing. And there was this moment where, they're like, okay, you've got to believe in Jesus or you're going to burn in hell for eternity. And it's like, oh, that's terrifying. That didn't feel right to me, but I was scared. So fear was my first motivation to go, well, I better believe in this Jesus guy. But then as I started reading about him, I was like, I actually like this guy. What he's saying seems true. I mean, this stuff about forgiveness and unconditional love, and he really seemed radical. I mean, even to me, I was watching, in my imagination, watching him among these religious leaders, and he's breaking rules, and he's doing things that they are like, what is this guy doing? So he didn't come across to me as this this pious man that's almost unattainable. He came across as very human and yet very spiritual. He's meeting me where I am, and I'm like, man, okay, so this Jesus guy seems very true to me. So I became very true to that path for a long time. Many years later, fundamentalism kept burning me. It was like, I don't know that I believe what you're saying about hell specifically. That if certain people don't believe certain things, they're going to burn for all eternity. That doesn't feel like love. That doesn't seem right to me. But again, prayer seemed very beautiful to me, and meditation, seemed like, man, this imagination realm from my childhood is still real. It's not something I have to let go of. But in fact, as a musician, this is the place that I come to and write songs. I meditate, and suddenly I have this idea for a song that comes into existence. So now here it is in what we call the material world, and it didn't used to exist. From our mindset, maybe it was in another realm, and I went there and brought it back. And I hear a lot of other artists say that, and so I guess, long story short, I let go of the fundamentalism thing. I did get a degree in theology, and I worked at churches for a while, but I just continued to butt heads with people and to get burnt and get called a heretic. And again, we were talking about that a little before we started, that was hurtful at first. People would be like, oh, you're talking about things you can't talk about. You're asking questions you're not supposed to ask. And I'm like, well, in the Bible, they were asking tons of questions. The Psalms are nothing but questions. These people engaging God, they're like, God, why? Where are you? And they're asking these questions, and that's how it seems to me that they're advancing. And if there is this relationship with the unseen, with God, they're actually advancing through the questions, So I have lots of questions, and that's part of why I'm here. I have a wide open mind. Love and unconditional love feel very true to me. The imagination realm as reality feels very true to me. I've had experiences there through meditation, and bring, like I said, songs to life and reality that I feel have healing power in people's lives. People tell me they do, so I believe it. And so I do believe there's more than what we see here in the material.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And that's what this is all about, is keeping an open mind. And a lot of what you were saying reminds me of what Jesus said, that unless you become like a little child, you shall by no means enter into the kingdom of heaven. And,
exactly.
And what we learn through these sorts of esoteric teachings is that our native state, our initial state, was a state of connectedness to the spiritual realms, that through epochs of time, humanity has fallen deeper and deeper into this state of materialism, where the material realm has become more dense and opaque than that spiritual realm. So even though the spiritual realm's still all around us, we can't see it. And so it's through going back and having that open, spiritual, childlike mind that we can return back to those realms.
Yeah.
That's where we're going. So that's really inspiring. And I'm glad that you're on the same sort of open-minded journey, and I know many people listening today are too. A little bit about myself is I grew up Catholic. I went to a Baptist church for a while. I spent time at a Methodist church and with Pentecostal churches. I went to a Seventh-day Adventist church for a couple years. I studied Buddhism and some of the New Age philosophies and things like that. I worked as a staff member at the Church of Scientology for a period of time. And my teaching, the teachings that I followed and the questions that I was asking kept bringing me back to kind of like you're saying, hitting my head up against a glass ceiling at whatever institution I was in. So there's only so much that the people there were able to tell me. And so then I had to go someplace that had the next level of answers. And that's kind of what's driven my spiritual journey, location to location. And so some years ago, around 4.5 years ago, I decided, because I had a lot of spiritual experiences growing up, just randomly going either into a vision through prayer or meditation or some other spectacular happening. And I'm listening to the scriptures talk about seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all things will be added unto you.
Right.
And I realized at that moment I've been separating all of these so-called spiritual experiences because they didn't have a place in my church experiences from heaven. And I realized that is part of heaven. These are indications and peripherals of those heavenly planes. And so I said, I am going to seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And so immediately upon doing a search on YouTube, trying to find some information that was going to concretely connect the spiritual dimensions with the kingdom of heaven, I came across an audiobook that was posted called How to Know Higher Worlds by an author named Rudolf Steiner. And that book had a profound impact in my life.
Cool.
Meditations in it had immediate effects, which told me this is the path. And his teachings of anthroposophy are really about Christian consciousness. They're a spiritual esotericism. There's a bunch of ways you could describe it, but ultimately it comes down to independent spiritual investigation through the development of our souls. There's various means and practices to refining ourselves so that way we're not so connected to the five senses, which is actually where the lusts of the flesh, the appetites of the flesh and all that are dragging us down. And so if we can rise above that, spiritual realities come into view.
Awesome.
I think our first discussion should be around this idea of Maya as an illusion. Maya being the Sanskrit word, I believe it's not Hindi, I think it's Sanskrit, for illusion. So the table in front of you or the wheel in front of you, everything seems solid. Science tells us it's a dense coagulation of atoms and molecules, which is one way to look at life, but ultimately it's fruitless and it's not going to get to the root of actual causes, because what we start to see in these interdimensional phases of consciousness is that these are all spiritual beings who have densified themselves, who've crystallized themselves enough in this dimension to look like still, inert, dead, objective material. But in fact, that is just an illusion.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting to me is even when you look at that, like from what we call the scientific realm, which I think I think that does have a lot to offer us. If you look at it with an open mind, if you don't look at it as, okay, this checklist, but you say, what are those atoms and molecules exactly? You know, what is it that we're studying when we look at that? I mean, because to me, I feel like we're getting into the spiritual realm. You're getting into things that a lot, quantum physicists, the things that they discover, they're like, wow, we don't know a whole lot. You know what I mean? They are discovering things all the time that I think that what they're getting into is the spiritual realm. You get into these things that are just so little, or even out in space that are just so big that you can't really put them in these boxes. And I think that that's what happens with churches too. There's a parallel going on because the churches, they just try to box things up and say, this is the way that it is, and this is what truth looks like. And it's like, truth is bigger than that. You can't hold it in that box. Whether it's scientific or religious or denominational, truth is too big for our boxes, and so these atoms and molecules, that's what we call them. But I feel like what we're really studying is the spiritual realm. They're trying to study it scientifically, but you're looking at spirit, that manifests as matter. And to me that makes sense on both. I go, well, the science of that actually makes sense spiritually. Everything is spiritual, manifesting before you as what we call reality.
And it's not a big secret, especially in the Christian circles. I think a lot of times we think of these sorts of ideas as being part of a spiritual woo-woo sort of, new age reality. But even the Bible says, be still and know I am God. Absolutely. And the thing is, everything around us looks like it's still. But as soon as we still our minds from its movement, the still things around us begin to move themselves and come alive. So it's that whole Zen sort of idea that our minds are like a pond, and we don't see the reflection of the sun while there's ripples on the surface of the pond. And it's instilling our mind that we still the surface of the pond, and then we see a reflection of the sun above us.
Such a beautiful analogy. That's awesome. Yeah. Very good. And you were talking about Jesus talking about the kingdom. And one of the things that hit me profoundly when I used to study so much in my theological studies was, if you look at the Greek, always Jesus is talking in the present tense. And so much of what I was taught before that is Jesus is talking about somewhere we're going to go someday. This heaven place, that's the kingdom of heaven. Well, Jesus was speaking in the present tense. He was talking about something that you experience now.
Mm-hmm.
So this kingdom that he's talking about all throughout, you must become like a child if you're going to enter the heaven presently. The Greek is very adamant, but he's saying right now, if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven and experience it now, he said the kingdom of heaven is near. It's among you. It's here now.
Inside of you and around you.
It's here now.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so a lot of people, they're like waiting for the pie in the sky someday.
Yeah.
But right now, Jesus was saying right now, 2,000 years ago, he was saying right now, experience it now. And it continues to be, you can experience the kingdom of heaven now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, again, even Jesus said these things, because a lot of people go, well, what you're saying is not what Jesus said. And it's like, it's actually exactly what Jesus said. It's just, if we're paying attention to it with an open mind rather than I can only believe what I've been told from my traditions, well, I'm sure there's a lot of truth. And I do believe there's a lot of truth in all the traditions and in all the boxes that have been set. There are truths there, but they might be leading to even truer truths, bigger truths than the boxes, So, and I think Jesus was all about that. He was shattering the boxes of his time already. 2,000 years ago, these were these boxes. He was breaking the laws, and he was shattering those boxes. And people are like, "What are you doing? You can't do that. You're a heretic. You can't do this stuff." And he was like, "I have to. I am the way, the truth, and the life. That I'm the Christ that's been in all of these religions all along. That when you find truth there, that's me manifested as a human.
Absolutely, yeah." I think this is going to quickly, we're going to have to take it in a direction that might be a bit jarring for a lot of people, but it has to be said in order to make sense of the overall big picture. And that is the subject of reincarnation.
Yeah.
A lot of Christians and most Christian churches don't have that on the books as a doctrine anymore. It used to be part of early church beliefs. It's a part of most every other religion in the entire world. It really is the only explanation for our purpose here, what the segment of life is even worth.
Yeah.
And as far as being able to answer the questions like, where did we come from and where are we going? So, general spiritual esoteric studies paint a picture of eternity outside of this life. And it basically is like this. Anything before this life between your prior death and this incarnation, where we go in higher states of consciousness and where we go after we die, these are all the higher spiritual realms of divine life. They are ethereal planes. There are what's called astral planes. There are what's called devaconic planes, which is our Sanskrit equivalent for heaven, land of the gods. And these are realms that we go to when we leave our body at night and we're sleeping, where we go and have those dreams that we can't remember when we come back from. And these are the places that we return to when we die and unpack these worldly experiences in the presence of angels and the hierarchies of angelic beings. And so it's become almost taboo to bring up the subject, but unfortunately, there's just no way to continue the discussion if we leave that important point out. So being more classically, theologically trained, obviously.
Yeah. Well, again, I come back to Jesus because he referenced it, and he referenced it. Again, you have to keep an open mind when you look at this, because he referenced it directly as if it was just a known thing. Kind of like you said, those early church, the early church fathers knew it. It wasn't up for debate. It wasn't a topic of taboo then. Jesus talked about it like, yeah, everybody knows. He said specifically John the Baptist is Elijah. Because they said, they challenged Jesus. I don't know if you remember this story, but they were always challenging Jesus. The religious leaders of his day, they were like, well, the scripture says that Elijah has to come again before the Messiah, or before the Christ arrives on earth. And Jesus said he has. It's John the Baptist.
And there's another event that occurred in the Bible when Jesus and the apostles were walking through an archway, and there was a beggar begging for alms, and he was blind. And the apostles asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? And instead of rebuking him for the apostasy of this, idea of reincarnation, he said, in this event, he said neither, but for the glory of God, that he should be healed. But I think that gives us a little window and insight into the minds of these people who walked with Jesus.
Right.
They believed in reincarnation.
There you
go. That would have been the first things they would have known not to have said, walking with Jesus, were that so. So another example.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that there are probably a whole lot more, but that's a good starting place. And a lot of people will probably try to say, no, that's not what they were saying, and they'll say, you're twisting what he's saying. And the thing is I stop them there and I go, wait a minute. Don't try to look at who's twisting what. Look at what he said. Just simply, and keep your mind open, keep your heart open, and just ask the question, what was he saying? He very specifically said, John the Baptist is Elijah. He's here again.
What would you say to people who then bring up the whole, it's appointed unto men once to die? And then, that scripture? I know people bring that up, and for me, there's just so many ways to, quickly treat that subject. Like, sure, in every incarnation, we do die,
right,
until we don't, until maybe a man attains that Atman, that higher state of being, and, the rare people who have attained that state already, they ascend like Jesus, with taking his physical body up with him and all.
Yeah. I haven't actually studied that specific one on the language breakdown side of things, but I find a lot of times that when you do that, it opens new truths. And that's what a lot of people in our society are lacking sometimes. When they go to the Bible, they're reading an English translation that has been translated from texts that were originally stated 2,000 years ago or more. And then they were in either Greek or in Hebrew, or maybe Aramaic, but then, over the years, the translations, as the old saying goes, a lot can get lost in translation, and does, I believe, because what happened for me, a big part of my journey, was when I started studying Greek in college, new windows and doors were opening like crazy. I was like, wait a minute, look at the tense that he said that particular word in, or look at, this brings a whole different context to what Jesus was saying, or to what whoever was teaching in that specific scripture or whatever was saying. And there's probably some truth there. Like, I don't know for sure, but I would say that what you're saying about each specific experience of death, it's appointed for man once to die. Well, maybe it's appointed for that manifestation of man to once die and then hit a new experience. So it's,
or his carnal self to die, that his higher self can be born up out of it.
Right.
Maybe in the broader scheme, that's what that
sure
is.
And that's the spiritual truth, that if you really broke down the language more, I'm sure that you could even look at it that way, and it reveals even more spiritual truth. Yeah.
Another thing that comes to mind is the idea that of all languages, some say that English is probably the coarsest, most simple language, having so few words to describe things from other languages that have multiple times the word, so they can speak on finer gradients. They can speak more concisely.
Absolutely.
Whereas we have to speak just ever so slightly more generally, word by word, just because we don't have the language.
Absolutely.
Exactly convey what they're saying.
Yeah.
And I think another important point is ancient writings written by the prophets and the seers and whoever, especially thousands of years ago, they were all in different states of consciousness than we are.
True.
We have never been more
point.
embroiled, more immersed in materialism than ever. And so the way people thought and spoke back then doesn't exactly compute word for word
Right.
for how we communicate these days.
Absolutely. That's such a good point. And that I think that's another thing that a lot of people miss when they come to an English translation of the Bible now, or whatever they're reading, what theology or whatever, is cultural, societal, historic context. Because people talk about keep things in context. Well, there's a lot of context going on here.
Mm-hmm.
2,000 years ago, like you're saying, that consciousness was very different. Awareness was very different. The things that they were talking about and they took for granted when they said it, they thought of things very differently than we do. So, yeah, I think there's so much truth to recognizing how important context is in the conversation.
Yeah. We have an interview today. I had to pre-record it with Dale because he was going to be unavailable for this slot. But Dale Brunsvold is the reader of over 200 Rudolf Steiner audiobooks, and they're all available for free at rudolfsteineraudio.com. And that is I have probably 30-something browsers on my phone open to that, to one book or another, because it is
awesome.
Absolutely my favorite site in the world. And so I will, I think we should play that interview, and we'll come back after that and say goodbye and tell you how you can find us at the Spiritual Realities Facebook page and other places. So I've got Dale Brunsvold on the line here. He's the reader of many Rudolf Steiner audiobooks. The last time I talked to him, it was somewhere around 50 days worth of audio that he's been recording since 1985. So I'm honored and excited to have him on today to talk about his project and some interesting details of Rudolf Steiner's philosophies. How you doing, Dale?
Good to talk to you, Robert.
Yeah, you too. So, would you mind taking a minute and just introducing yourself, kind of your history, how you got into anthroposophy, which is the spiritual science as taught by Rudolf Steiner, and what it's meant to you?
Sure. So, I guess we're talking about a spiritual path. And so I must have had an inclination towards such a thing, most of my life, I guess. And, as a kid, read people like Carlos Castaneda, Carl Jung, Gurdjieff, various New Age ideas, I suppose, for a time. Until as I got older, I focused more on philosophy and mathematics, which I'd been studying. And in a graduate philosophy course, I ran into the work of Steiner through one of the fellow students in the class and realized that I'd really found something deeply important for our time. And it was only 100 years old by then. It's Steiner's work, as you know, really started in 1900, and he died in 1925. So in a very short time of 25 years, he produced just an unbelievable amount of work, both theoretical, shall we say, but also, and more astonishingly, practical. And that's the amazing thing, that something that we would otherwise think of as only a spiritual set of ideas, that I'm going to enjoy in my own private life and become enlightened, those kinds of orientations that we all know people have. We had somebody saying, oh no, the spiritual is actually that which gives life, meaning, and real wisdom to our undertakings on the earth. And we've lost it. Or we have it now in weak, diluted forms, simple belief systems that we try to rigidly follow in order to kind of keep some of this wisdom in hand. And he said, we can't even do that anymore. We have to become really self-aware in what we're doing. We can't just blindly follow things. And so he then gives the examples that he does. Let me just talk about those just for a second. In education, we have the Waldorf schools or the Steiner schools. So for those listening to this, I'm sure they've heard of those. And those were started by this man, Rudolf Steiner, in 1919. As well, in agriculture, there was such trouble with pests and various kinds of diluted soils that Steiner was asked to help with that, and through his spiritual investigations, came up with biodynamic agriculture, which is a worldwide movement now, though no one would know Rudolf Steiner was connected to it. He also did this in medicine, and there's pharmaceutical companies that people have heard of that were started through Steiner's ideas and indications and even methods he suggested, such as Weleda, such as Dr. Hauschka's products, Walla, Uriel Pharmacy, all these things. So just to kind of touch on such a massive subject, I thought I'd mention those things. Okay, I'm done with that one.
Those are great examples. As you know, I just got back actually from Dornach, Switzerland, where I visited the Goetheanum, which is the headquarters of his spiritual movement, and it was an amazing visit. And met up with a Facebook friend who lives over in that area, Goddard. And so, yeah, I know that you have been there 3 times now. And how long have you been visiting there? When did you start?
I was lucky enough. I probably never would have gone there, but I had the good fortune in my life of marrying a wonderful woman. And she had a sister, in fact, who lives in Germany, and who live close to the Goetheanum, and in fact is, as we call ourselves, anthroposophists. It's a funny-sounding word until you say it a few times, and then people who try to study Steiner's work and take it into their hearts and souls as much as they can. And so she would take us over there a few times, and so that started, I suppose, in '92 was the first time I was there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, great. I appreciate that background. It's good to connect with you on the Goetheanum, and I'm excited to get to some of the tactical, specific kind of questions about anthroposophy. Also, can you again mention how long you've been recording these and about how many audiobooks you have available at rudolfsteineraudio.com?
Thank you, Robert, for mentioning that. I do forget that. I did start recording Steiner in 1978, and that was because of just friends, and I had cassettes, and I made copies of the books driving in the car. And then I had them, and I had a few, maybe 5 or 6 books at that time that I would recopy onto cassettes as the cassettes would die. And then the Internet shows up. And so the MP3 idea, so I transferred them onto MP3, and then it's when I started to see the Internet develop, and I'm 62, I should mention to everyone, so I saw this sort of blossom into the world in that way, and sort of tried to keep up with it as best I could, so that it became a strangely beautiful, natural process, whereby around 2005, I realized, well, I've got all these books recorded, and nobody's doing this on the web. So I wrote to the publishing houses that publish Steiner and asked if there'd be some way that I could just put these up on the website for complete freedom. They don't have to register. They can just come and download and listen to whenever and whatever they want. And they decided in their generosity, and I will say their names, steinerbooks.org is in America, and rudolfsteinerpress.com is in England. They gave me permission to do this, and since 2005, it has really become a love of mine and a blessing, I must say, in my whole life. And I think I'm approaching, of Steiner's 365 collected works, I've done about 200 of them.
Wow.
So that's roughly where it is right now. And it's just a joy and something I do whenever I can, mostly once a day at least. And it's given me more blessings than I can ever imagine describing, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I've spent many, many hours listening to your voice in my car, and his writings and your recordings have had a massive impact on my life and spiritual development. So I just want to thank you for that, and I'm glad we can talk here today about this. So I think the first thing I think we should talk about is Steiner breaks down the evolution of Earth's history and the epochs leading up to this one and where we're going. Could you speak to that?
So, Robert, let's do this instead. That's a great question, of course. Let's just for a moment imagine when Steiner was asked, well, what does anthroposophy really mean? And Steiner said, well, it's an understanding of through the wisdom, through the spirituality and the wisdom in the human being, of finding the spirituality and the wisdom in the world. Okay? So For just a moment, let's actually look at the human being as Steiner saw him, which we would say, well, why would you have to do that, right? Everybody sees each other, and right, that should be pretty easy. Is it okay if we just shift this just a little bit?
Oh, yes, please.
So what the heck is a human being? And, you and I, we look at each other, and what we see are essentially just a physical body, right? And we see a bunch of activity in that physical body. Oh, cell division. Okay. Oh, and there's moving blood. And we say, okay, well, those things are telling us that we're alive. And really, if you think about it, there's not much of a depth to that observation in our lives generally. I think it's our culture or the way we're raised. We just say, oh, yeah, we're alive, yeah. And then we hear each other speak, and we have understanding and anger and happiness and all these manner of feelings, and we see that we're conscious. But that's about it. We don't spend a lot. Maybe in psychology we'd study it a little bit. And then, but it's all rather vague and shallow. At least I'm going to say that that's how it appears after you begin to study anthroposophy. Yeah, those things aren't wrong, but they're so vague and shallow that, gosh, what an empty life we live in a way. So somebody like Rudolf Steiner comes along who has, let's say this, he has an enlarged field of sense-based phenomena. He's able to see the sense world that you and I see, but he also sees in a way as concrete. This is going to be strange for people who are listening to this. This is not belief. This is not in any way thought up by somebody in fantasy or imagination. It is, in fact, phenomena from organs of perception, let's say, that are called, we'll call them spiritual organs of perception, where they receive information from those sense organs and then think through what it's giving them and enlarge and deepen their understanding of the world. And so Steiner, to me, from all the studies I've done, I'm not a massive scholar, but I've done a lot of it in my life. Nobody touches him. He's done this with a naturalness and a clarity that's just awe-inspiring. And as we said, really has even created institutions on the earth that tens of thousands of people work with that are bearing fruit. So Steiner says, okay, let's look at the human being. And he says, we see this physical body that we have. Well, what about it, he says? Well, first of all, this thing you think is a physical body is in fact dissolving all the time. You're losing your pancreas about once a day, so there's something building your pancreas back up again. Otherwise, you would just fall to dust. Your liver, every 7 days or so, is got to be rebuilt because it's falling to dust. Your whole body is replaced. All the cells are replaced approximately every 7 years, especially in the early years of your life. So even you and I saying we have a physical body, we're in fact living in an illusion. If we were really careful, and this is the thing about Steiner, he was so darn careful about what he was seeing and what he said about what he saw. And we don't. We're pretty lackadaisical and easygoing about things, and he wasn't. He was a scientist, a rigorous, disciplined scientist about these things. He said, and here the clairvoyant in him speaks and says, there is in fact a set of forces, they are cosmic forces, that are called life. And when those forces enter into the body, they create cell division. They create all this activity going on in our body. And instead of seeing those forces themselves, which we're not able to see, they're invisible because we don't have organs of perception to gather their sense data up, we instead look at the shadows on the wall and we see cell division. We go, life. And we see all these things happening in our body and go, life. But what we're seeing, Steiner argues, is we're seeing the results of life and not life itself. Mm-hmm. And once that's kind of acknowledged as a possibility, I'm not telling people obviously to believe any of this, it becomes very fascinating because that whole world of life forces has its own destiny, has its own story and history throughout the history of humanity that is in a way separate from us. And Steiner shares that history and enlarges your understanding of the world immeasurably. So we have a physical body, we have this, let's call it a life body. He also calls it a body of formative forces. He also calls it an etheric body. He says, and you look at the plant realm, and you see, of course, there's the plant realm. It's the mineral kingdom, which we have, but then it has these life forces permeating it. And that's all it has, as far as we can tell, whereas we're so much more than that, right? But we have at least that much. And then he goes on to talk about sentience and consciousness that we see in the animal realm. And what that is, and that is another different set of cosmic spiritual forces penetrating the human being and the animal realm, but not the plant or the mineral kingdoms, and manifesting in those realms, in us and in the animals, with sentience, with consciousness, with pleasure and pain experiences, with an inner life, etc., 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 right? And that world has its own history, has its own destiny throughout eons of time that Steiner then shares with us as well. And then finally, and I'm sorry, this is so compacted together. I hope people understand that we're talking about 20 minutes here, but we have in the human being, finally, let's say for now, not only this ocean of consciousness that we live in with the animal realm, right? This massive ocean of awareness and sentience and consciousness, but inside of that, it appears to us, as far as we know so far, without arrogance, by the way, as any of this being described, or highfalutenness, we found ourselves in this ocean of consciousness. I am an I am. I became aware of myself as an I being. And Steiner says, and in this we see really the crux of all of creation. All of creation wanted to come to the point where an awareness would be produced that could reflect all of creation to itself. So I look out now at sort of the end of it all and see creation and go, oh, there's creation. I am recognizing creation. And this is all part of something much bigger, but it's a beginning. And then he describes these I beings, you, me, all the people we know, these individualities, as in fact, he says, being reincarnations that go through lifetimes, gathering experience, giving, taking, growing in freedom and love as an ongoing creation of something we haven't really discussed yet, a divine spiritual world that's populated by divine spiritual beings who are working on this creation in an ongoing way. It's not finished at all. Okay, I'll stop there. I feel so constricted by our time frame.
I know. And
was that just too overwhelming? Do you think
that
we
was
just blow
amazing.
everybody away?
Dale, I love it, and you did a great job because, like you said,
good.
it is a very dense, loaded sort of question and subject matter. And that's what this is all about, the spiritual realities, the spiritual worlds, and that's what his teachings ultimately build up to, the development of clairvoyant spiritual faculties to perceive those dimensions and the kind of knowledge that a person needs to attain to make sense of it once they get there. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I think you really did a good job answering how we evolve into a spiritual or how we're evolving into spiritual beings capable of attaining this spiritual destiny. I want to talk briefly about the mystery of Golgotha, and I know this is another very loaded subject, but its significance as taught by Steiner, because the subject matter itself leads us to spiritual realities, but this is a very important matter that a lot of people, Christians, don't have as deep of an understanding of, because spiritual science just isn't that prevalent.
Yeah, and it is a toughie. I hope someday we can talk again, because each of these things we've talked about easily could do an hour, and we'd be less tired at the end of the hour than we were at the beginning, just because the ideas are so rich. So let's say this then as best we can, that in the mystery of Golgotha, as Steiner sees it, is again, and I don't want to sound impersonal, because in fact in this particular case is not impersonal at all, but nevertheless I think this side needs to be described, is again cosmic forces that are coming to the earth. Whoa, what's that, right? Isn't this a person? Yes, it is. And so we're speaking of a being so sublime, so exquisite, that, let's say, that it is the Son in the Trinity, the Christ being, the creator God of the universe itself. And this being, in the way that evolution was occurring, again, a story I hope we can share sometime of the evolution of the earth, that there was a dying going on, that the earth was going into middle age and old age. As all living things do, they pass into an older time. And in the wisdom of the cosmos, This being, and I'm going to say it this way, this is me talking, bent down and designed a body on earth that could withstand its presence. And when the fullness of time, right, came, that being incarnated into that body, and by doing that deed, not by a teaching, because if you study the Bible, really you'll find all that wisdom in the Hindu scriptures, in the Buddhist scriptures, all the stuff that comes before. So really, Christianity is not a teaching, we could argue. Steiner argues this. It is, in fact, the description of the good news, the deed of Christ, which brought new revivifying forces to the soul realm of humanity and allowed our evolution to continue. And this is very different. We all think, no, if you don't believe in Christ, you're going to go to hell, and all these kinds of sad, deteriorated things happened in the evolution of humanity. And that's just, I don't want to judge anyone when I say that, but in comparison to reading Steiner and studying these ideas, there is a shocking difference in the two. So I just wanted to mention that. I don't know if that helps us at all, Robert, get anywhere with that. But that can be kind of a teaser for people.
Absolutely.
If we get a chance to speak again.
Yeah, good. Those are good talking points.
Okay.
And we are ending
Yes.
at the end of the interview. There were some more things I want to talk about regarding some of the auxiliary exercises and things that we'll probably have to wait to next time, because I think I'm going to have you on often.
Oh, I would love that.
Awesome.
And again, it's so wonderful that you're taking this initiative on. It's just a real important thing in the world. Thank you.
Thank you for being on. All right. Well, thanks, Dale. And again, anybody who's interested in getting the recordings, they can go to rudolfsteineraudio.com and just look up Rudolf Steiner, pick up maybe How to Know Higher Worlds, and that could have a life-changing effect on you like it did on me.
Indeed.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Dale, for your time.
And welcome back to the States. I hope we get a chance to talk about that more later on.
Definitely. I look forward to it. Thanks a lot.
You bet. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right. That was a great interview. I always love talking to Dale. He's so full of insight and full of anthroposophical knowledge. So we're going to close out the show. We had a great time here today. I just want to encourage anybody who wants to follow up to go to newprecept.com. You can follow us at Spiritual Realities on Facebook. And if you're interested in being featured as a sponsor, you have any questions, comments, anything like that, you can email me at robert@newprecept.com. That's Robert, ROBERT, at newprecept, NEWPRECEPT.com.
Cool.
Adam?
So, yeah, if you'd like to check out what I do in the world, I make music and I do everything with my wife, Christy. She and I, we write songs together. I'm primarily the songwriter, but she sings with me. We started a duo a few years ago called 3 Day Flight, and that has evolved into more of what we call a musical collective. So a lot of other people play music with us. We'll have string players or guitar, drums, and that kind of thing. So we have full recordings. We would love for you to hear. You can download them or stream them free at 3dayflight.com. You could also, if you use Spotify or iTunes or any of that stuff, it's there as well. But again, that's 3dayflight.com. And then also, we make food here in Memphis, in the Midtown area at a cafe called Imagine Vegan Cafe. And yes, we are vegan, but don't be scared of that because my wife is brilliant and she knows how to make amazing tasting food. It's not all rice cakes and quinoa and things you can't pronounce. It's comfort food. And trust me, it's delicious. It's a big part of how she even opened my mind to the idea of vegetarianism first and then eventually veganism. And that's how Robert and I actually met, was at Imagine Vegan Cafe.
That's right. And, I moved here to Memphis from Dallas, becoming vegetarian some years prior. And one of the things I missed the most was some of those meals that were just like Hooters chicken wings. The most unnutritious thing in the world is the thing I miss the most. And their drumsticks, with that barbecue sauce, fit the bill. And everything there, the spaghetti is the best spaghetti in the world. So,
my dad thinks so too about the spaghetti. It's his favorite spaghetti he's ever had, and he's not vegan at all. You know,
Mm-hmm.
he's a meat eater, and he eats
Same with my mom,
that
yeah.
spaghetti, and he's like, that's some of the best spaghetti I've ever had.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Christy would be grateful for that compliment. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think yeah, it is great. In the future, some of the subjects that we will be broaching are going to be more of some of what we've been talking about, more in depth on the epochs or the stages of Earth's evolution. And it sounds boring, history and things that seem inconsequential today, but they are very interesting because you, my friend, are a reincarnated being. You were alive during those periods and you were going through different stages of evolution. And it will make a lot of sense to you as far as why you are the way you are, what faculties you have underdeveloped, that you're developing, and that you will develop and appreciate in the future. And it's a big part of the story of where we're at. And we'll talk about the parts of man, the ethereal body and the astral body and these other elements that compose our spiritual beingness. And these are also vitally important if we're going to understand what the seers and clairvoyants are seeing in the spiritual dimensions. I've had some amazing spiritual interdimensional experiences, which is what prompted this whole study and even the show. It's not a subject which is brought up or talked freely on because there's a lack of experience for a lot of people, and then it's also a taboo because it's considered realm of fantasy. But I believe a lot of listeners have had spiritual experiences that either they can't explain, whether it's a loved one visiting them, whether it was a vision of some kind. And in the future, we're going to be taking calls and discussing those sorts of things and, making this a public dialogue.
Cool.
Come out of the shadow, spiritual people. We have got the floor.
Absolutely. And I think there's so many people that have, like you said, have these experiences, whether even just emotional, they're just overcome with emotion, not even necessarily a vision or anything, but they're just overwhelmed with what they feel, and they don't necessarily know how to put words around it just yet, and they don't know all of these different realms that you're talking about specifically by name and by word, but they've had the experiences, and they just don't, and so they hopefully we can keep it real too and invite people to that conversation and say, where are you at? You don't have to know what any of this stuff that we're saying means specifically, but just tell us what you've experienced.
Yeah. This is a study in comparative religion, and we're all using different words and different systems of teaching in order to explain and express these sorts of things. And so I try to study a little bit of everything, and hopefully I can correlate where you're at and where I'm at together, and we can all share in the same sort of spiritual feeling that occurs once in a while in a person's life, unexpected.
Absolutely.
So we are closing off the show. Again, this is a great show. I'm really honored to have had your time for as long as you've been on. We will see you again next Sunday at 11 to noon Central Time. You can listen to us at kwam990.com. We're on 107.9 FM, 990 AM. You can follow us on Facebook, again, at Spiritual Realities. Do a search for that. And visit my site, newprecept.com. And email any suggestions, comments, anything that's infuriated you today to robert@newprecept.com. So, God bless, and we will be with you again shortly.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you, Adam.
KWAM, your news and information station with CBS News updates every hour on the hour. KWAM Memphis.